Hello again, and once again I have absolutely smashed through the next John Marsden in the Tomorrow When the War Began series. I've just finished number 4, which is Darkness Be My Friend. One of the book haul where I got 10 books for $1. Can't go past that. I thought, I've never read the whole Tomorrow series. I'd only ever read the first and the second, maybe the second. This is a great opportunity to read them all 7 of them. And I can't believe that I'd never read them before. They are so good. And I've raved about them in every single review that I've done. Okay, so with number 4, I started noticing a few themes in the books. Incidentally, all of this is going to be spoilers, and if you haven't read the rest of the Tomorrow series and you want to, don't watch these reviews. These reviews assume that you have or that you've seen the other reviews. So with number 4, I thought I could see a definite, very strong, repetitive plan in all the books. So it builds up through some scene setting, and there's usually some good Australian scene setting in there. You've got stuff that's pure Australianisms. Ali and her friends all are aspects of rural Australia. And they're all of them quite cleverly done. I think Ali herself is classic white Australian rural farming community. She's farmed, her father farmed, her grandparents farmed, and it's always been their farm, so that's her place and it's her knowledge. She's grown up as a single child in a rural property with a lot to do and has done all the things that you do in a property. It's primarily a sheep farm, as I understand it. Her best friend Homer, who was also in the camping lot that went up to the Gap and Howell and escaped the invasion. Also another strong rural farming family, but his were originally Greek, so that adds another strong theme in Australian society. Was it more so in the 90s than it is now? I don't think so. There have always been a lot of other nationalities in Australia. If there's one nationality that I'm finding conspicuous in its absence in this series, you don't see any Aboriginal characters. Now, I suppose it's better for Marsden not to do characters that he isn't very familiar with. It's only here in number 4 that I really noticed the absence. So it hasn't been a huge absence, but still. The other characters each bring their own little loading to the story. We've got one who has a slightly Christian religious type background, which isn't all that normal in Australia. You've got another one from an Asian background who is still with us in this book. You've got lots of different parts of Australia, and that is always part of the scene setting. Now, another thing that always happens, you always build up through some action to a huge major action, and then the culmination of each book is a big guerrilla action in which our heroes, from where are we, take down something big of the enemy that have invaded Australia. And the last part of the book is always sort of a resting phase where they get a chance to recoup before going. And the resting phase always starts to at least set up the next story for the next volume. This is very much a series. None of them, except the first one, really work as standalones. But before you reach that resting phase in the book, up to now, there's always been a bad thing happening, and it tends to be losing a member of their group. I was so bound up and caught up in the story and the characters that I actually had to take a bit of a break toward the end of this one. I thought we're heading into that point where the big guerrilla action happens, and it's obviously going to be the airport, and we're going to lose someone. And I didn't want to lose anyone, and I feared that there was a lot of foreshadowing that was telling me who was going to be lost. I didn't want to lose them. Turns out I was wrong, and he's changed a couple of fairly significant parts of his storytelling methodology from the first 3 books to the 4th. No big guerrilla action is successful. Instead, they fail, but they don't fail fatally or dramatically. So that was an interesting variation. So in terms of the actual plot that you get in this book, at the end of number 3, our team had been evacuated by helicopter to New Zealand, where they were recouping. So at the beginning of this one, they're still in New Zealand, and we get a really good perspective into how troubled and how affected these teenagers have been by everything they experienced. We're still seeing things wholly through Ellie's eyes. She's the narrator. There's no longer any explanation of why she's writing this down. She just is. She's been seeing a psychiatrist or a psychologist, and most of the other members of the team have as well. She mentions how she's surprised that not even the boys object to that. They're all becoming psychologically and mentally damaged in different ways. Despite that, after a bit of recuperation, the New Zealand army personnel, is it Major? I think it's a Major Finley. Was it a Colonel Finley? Colonel Finley. Comes to them and asks them to go back. So this comes back to how important their hometown of Werribee has become in the invasion. And I did have mixed thoughts about that. On one hand, we've been told a number of times that Werribee is a tiny little town. No one would pay any attention to it if it wasn't the nearest access to Cobbler's Bay, which is a wonderful natural harbour. But at the end of book 3, they'd pretty much blown Cobbler's Bay up. So that wasn't a natural harbour anymore. It made no sense to me initially, thinking about it, that the enemy had made the tiny Werribee airport into a major air hub. Now, most small towns in Australia do have an airport, but it's often just a dirt track where maybe the Flying Doctor or a couple of small craft can land, and that's what Werribee used to have. It's been built up to be a major hub. But then I thought, if you've invaded a country and you've got all these lines of communication and supplies, and in this case colonists coming in, once you've got a hub established, maybe you'd want to keep it, and that's perhaps why they built up the airport. Anyway, so the kids agree to go in with a New Zealand platoon and show them around. The New Zealand platoon's initial focus isn't told to them, but it becomes really clear that their focus is to get rid of the airport or get rid of the planes in it. Now, this was really interesting because here they are coming into their own territory with these New Zealanders who they get along with well. And in the initial going into the town, it was also interesting to me that the whole group came back, because considering how little authority or autonomy they were willing to give the kids, it seemed strange that all of them were there. But never mind, makes for a better story. If that's the only reason John Marsden did it, that's still a great reason. So for the initial push into town, where they want the kids to show the New Zealand platoon around Werribee so that they can know how to get to the airport and stuff, they choose only 2 of the kids to go with them, and that's Ellie and that's Lee. At one point going through the town, Ellie fails to maintain silence. She gets freaked out at the notion of watching another person killed in front of her, which, is good. It's a good plot building device. Since we're seeing the her slow deterioration under the pressures, it makes sense. It's not a big fail. It's not a fail that anyone wouldn't expect from someone who wasn't a trained soldier. But as a result of that, she's moved out, and the next thing we know, the New Zealand platoon have vanished without a trace, and Lee, who was also with them, has also vanished. So the kids all go back into town. They do eventually meet back up with Lee, but the New Zealand platoon has vanished without a trace. I guess we'll find out early on in the next book what happened to them, because I think that's a bit how Marsden operates. In any case, having lost the New Zealand platoon, they decide to do the airport on their own. And it's a tribute to the fact that this book is ramping up in the way that an invading force would ramp up, that they aren't successful. So a lot of their early successes came from them knowing things that rural kids know, like the fact that the things that you shouldn't do, well, instead of doing the things that they not doing the things they shouldn't do, they're doing them and using them as an offensive weapon. And in this book, they do something that is very much an offensive weapon, and probably in the 90s when CNN wasn't as big a thing, is probably even more unexpected then than it is now. Bushfires in Australia are a force of nature, and they're terrifying, and I'm sure in the 2020-2021 bushfires, the world has become aware of it, but in 1996, all right, this one would have been published around 1996. It probably wasn't as well known worldwide. When the kids are escaping a group of soldiers that are coming after them with shotguns and they're unarmed, eventually in desperation they start a bushfire that goes towards the soldiers. And that's an example of how Marsden really uses Australia and Australianisms as part of the plot in ways that are exciting and make sense. So I read a bit of an interview that was written about Tomorrow When the War Began years ago when it first came out. And apparently Marsden was inspired at least partly by watching an Anzac Day march. And a large number of teenagers were in attendance, and the writer of the article claims that Marsden started wondering how they would do and what they would do if they were put in the same position that their grandparents had been put in at their age. Because popular media do tend to talk down to children and teenagers and sort of almost, maybe less so now, but they used to minimize their abilities. And rural teenagers have plenty of abilities. I'm sure townies do as well. It's just that they're never given the credit. So he created this book series in which he gives credit to the possibilities of modern teenagers in Australia. And I think that he's done a great job. I think it's really interesting. This book series was apparently translated into 5 other languages and has gone all the way around the world. It did get a bit of criticism, but largely it was very well received worldwide, which I hadn't known. I thought it was relatively unknown. It's stood the test of time really well. And I think of all the young adult series that I've read in the last 10 years, this has got to be in the top 3. It's well written, it's got good characters, it's got exciting events, it keeps you on the edge of your seat, it's got so much good that I am going to come out of Darkness Be My Friend and dive straight into the number 5 because I can't resist and I'm just going to keep going.